Good morning. The witness that we will hear first of all is Mr. Darryl Conner. Can you hear me, Mr. Conner?
Yes, I can.
Right. Now, I understand, Mr. Conner, you're in your office and you're alone in the office. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Right. Now, you're about to be asked questions by Mr. Connell, who can you see on your screen Mr. Connell, who you may not know who Mr. Connell is, but do you have a view of the team sitting on my right? Maybe two or three people?
Yes, I can. I can see Mr. Connell, yes.
Right. Now, before we begin, I understand you're prepared to take the oath.
Yes, that's correct.
Could I ask you, remaining seated, raise your right hand and repeat these words after me. I swear by Almighty God
I swear by Almighty God
that I will tell the truth,
that I will tell the truth,
the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you very much. I'll now hand over to Mr. Connell.
Good morning, Mr. Conner.
Good morning.
If you encounter any difficulty in either seeing me or following what I'm saying to you, please just let us know. We can certainly see you, so that's a positive. Likewise, if I ask you about, for instance, documents or whatever, and for some reason there's a difficulty having a look at them, could you just please indicate? I'll check with you again, but just wanted to flag that at the outset. Now, sorry, and that's one of the problems with the remote. I can't talk over you. So I think you gave an answer there that I didn't pick up.
Yeah, I just said certainly.
Fine. You've given a statement following the issue of a questionnaire, and I think you've had access to that statement. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And are you content to adopt that statement as your evidence at the inquiry?
Yes, I am.
Thank you. Let me just start with a little background information, if I may. You're currently employed and have been employed since 2021 with NSS Assure. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And just give us a brief indication of what it is you do there.
Sure, no problem. So at NHS Scotland Assure, I'm a senior engineer and also an authorising engineer for healthcare ventilation systems.
And what does being a senior engineer at NSS Assure mean you actually do with your time?
I do various tasks working for NHS Scotland Assure. One of them is contributing towards healthcare guidance, the Scottish Technical Memorandums. I contribute towards the revision and output of them. I also work on CASAR, which is Key Stage Assurance Reviews for new healthcare projects at various stages through the design, from initial assessment all the way through to commissioning and handover. And as working as an authorising engineer, I provide services to various health boards where I carry out ventilation audits, and I provide external business as usual ad hoc support for guidance, interpretation and general support to the health boards.
I'm not sure we've necessarily heard of the review process that you participate in as yet. I wonder if you could just walk us through what that actually involves NSS Assure doing in relation to a project.
Yes, so there's various stages of a design project or a building project, which are outlined within the REBA guidance and the SCIM guidance, which is the Scottish Capital and Investment Manual. And it essentially takes a project at concept, initial assessment, and then it goes to outline business case. It then proceeds on to a full business case, and then it goes to construction, and then it goes to commissioning, validation, and then eventual handover to the client. What NHS Assure does under the Key Stage Assurance Review is we are brought in to conduct a review of the information supplied by the project at whatever stage that we're brought into it. Ideally, we're there to kind of benchmark the design against the outgoing guidance that's available, whether it be British standards, technical memorandum, SIBSI guidance, or the building standards, and obviously the Health and Safety at Work Act. We provide detailed review of the design proposals, and we feed that back to the project team in order to provide an external, impartial, supported or non-supported status to allow them to progress to the following stage of the design concept. So that's what's a kind of high level overview, if you like, of what we provide and what we're involved in within the Key Stage Assurance Review.
Sure, no, that's very helpful, Mr. Conner. What you provide, is that advice or instruction? How does it work in practical terms?
So in practical terms, generally what happens is, for example, if it was a full business case review, the expectation is that the design is almost fully fledged and it's ready in concept to be put into build. What we do as a team collectively is review the various disciplines within that project proposal. And we look for any non-compliances, we'll look for any areas of conflict, if you like, within the design. Pretty much everything that we do has the kind of core principle that infection control is right up the middle of it. So we have a view that it's very specific to the health built environment. And I believe the service itself was formed as a result of aspects of what's happened with the Queen Elizabeth and also the Royal Hospital for Children in Edinburgh. So it's more of a proactive measure to get ahead of design prior to it going to build, and to ensure that all necessary diligence is taking place, so that any shortfalls in design or problems can be avoided, ultimately for the patient, the end user. That's essentially what it is.
Yeah, that's very helpful, Mr. Conner. You used the word in your last answer, ensure. Now, can I just come back to the question that I asked you? Your answer was very helpful, but I just want to check what the position is. Let's say you find something that you're not happy with. I'm just using that in a layman's terms, doesn't matter what the detail is. Something that you don't think is correct or doesn't conform to guidance or whatever it happens to be. What are you doing? Are you advising about it? Or are you telling somebody that they have to fix it? Or how does that work?
So essentially the output from NHS Scotland Assure under KSAR is eventually there's a fully written QA report that's issued to the client.
Just let me interrupt you there. There's a fully written, can you just tell me what that report was called?
It's a KSAR review report.
KSAR review, thank you.
Yes. So if you were to say come across a significant design concern, it's structured in a fashion where it looks at the governance aspects of the project. It also breaks down into the various disciplines, whether it be electrical, mechanical or plumbing. And everything that any observations that are made are directly benchmarked in reference to the current outgoing guidance, to kind of give that basis of cross comparison, if you like, and to demonstrate, to raise the question of whether it's going to be fit for purpose or not. That information is provided to the health board themselves at the end of the KSAR process, and the onus is on them, if you like, to take that on board and develop a an action plan, if you like, in order to address these highlighted issues prior to getting recommendation to moving on to the next design stage.
So you tender advice. What then would happen if, for instance, a board looked at your advice and said, well, that's all very interesting, but we've got different ideas for whatever the topic is. We're going to do something that's not in accordance with the advice. How do you ensure that something's done about it?
I've asked that question myself before, to be honest, and I've had it advised from our director, and our prerogative is essentially based on the output of NHS Assure's report. If there is an unsupported status, the project does not progress.
Well, that's helpful. And presumably that, whether the project progresses, is that a decision for the board or for somebody else? Do you know? It may not be a question that you can answer, Mr. Conner.
I would say perhaps I can't answer that as well. I think maybe my my head of engineering or assistant director would probably be better placed to answer that question.
Yes. Well, thank you very much for your help on that topic in any event, because it's not a topic that was directly covered in your original questionnaire. So if I can perhaps move from NSS Assure back to your days at the Queen Elizabeth. I think I'm right in saying from your statement that you first joined the team there in 2014, is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And you held a number of roles there, a duty manager, then an estates manager, then an interim site manager, and then site manager. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
Thank you. And you eventually left there in 2021. Can you remember when?
I believe it was July 2021.
Thank you. And just so we have a picture of what you were doing, what's the difference between duty manager and manager? Because I think you were an estates duty manager first.
Yes. So an estates duty manager essentially is to provide out of hours 24-hour response to estates related issues, essentially breakdowns or emergencies. It was, and I believe still is, a shift team, 5 shift teams providing 24/7 response out of hours, out with working hours. So it provides that from Monday to Friday, say, it gives you that night shift cover, and it gives you cover over the weekend to address any out of hours or any emergency responses.
Yeah. And I think at the time you were an estates duty manager, you had particular interest in electrical systems. That was your area of responsibility. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. Fundamentally, I was electrically biased. So when I started as estates duty manager, one of the roles that we had to adopt was to start to train as authorised persons for relevant disciplines. So I undertook high voltage and low voltage systems, AP training and appointments, and that allowed me to obviously provide out of our support under the estates duty manager banner, but also to engage and manage and control planned authorised persons work for specific shutdowns within the hospital at different stages. It could maybe only be carried out of hours.
Thank you. I think, again, this is covered in your statement. I won't bother to bring it up just now. You became a estates manager day shift in 2018, and at that point you started to manage the ventilation systems. Is that correct?
Yes, I believe I came off the shifts it was around about April 2018, and moved on to a day shift estates manager role, where my remit was to take over the management of the ventilation maintenance for the hospital.
And in your statement, you explain what that involved in some detail, and I don't need to get you to deal with that. I think you were working beside Kerr Clarkson, is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. I worked alongside Kerr.
And you say in your statement you were using SHTM 0301, the various parts of it, as your guidance as to what you were supposed to be finding. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
Thank you very much. And then later you became interim site manager and then site manager. And ultimately, when you were site manager, again, you were back to looking at electrical systems primarily. Is that right?
Yes, I was. That's correct.
Thank you very much. Just bear with me. Looking at page 85 of your witness statement, can I just check, since this is the first document, can you see that?
Yes, I can.
Thank you very much. I won't ask you every time, but if you have a problem, please just indicate to us. You are asked in the run-up to these questions about training, and I see, in addition to the authorised person work you told us about earlier, you're talking about being AP for ventilation systems, about at the bottom third of that page in September 2019. See, that's the date that's given there. Is that correct?
That would be September 2018, I believe.
That'd be 2018.
Yes. Person's training for ventilation in September 2018.
And when were you then appointed as AP ventilation?
Not straight away. Generally after you carry out your relevant training, the authorising engineer will conduct an interview of your skill sets, your knowledge, your previous experience, your site experience, and your site familiarity prior to providing a recommendation for appointment to the designated person. At which point the designated person will issue you with an offer of appointment for you to accept in writing. So that happened after I conducted my training. I can't remember the exact date that my appointment was signed.
Thank you. And just to finish that section, can we just look at the top of the next page, 86? I see you say here, training assisted me in applying its principles to the hospital's sizable ventilation asset to drive compliance with SHTM 0301, and also under the correct governance, the implementation and control of a safe system to work. Just tell us what you were learning about there.
So the authorised person training for ventilation essentially is fundamental. It casts a light and gives you knowledge, and it presses on the onus for the importance of validation of a ventilation asset and subsequent annual verification of a ventilation asset. The safe system of work, in electrical, for example, there's a designated safe system of work where you're working under a permit to work system. Within SHTM 0301, the current outgoing guidance recommends a request for isolation of the ventilation plant, but it gives you the overview that you have to have some type of control measure in place to, one, record that the verification itself is going to take place and that the relevant parties that are involved know about it, agree to it, they agree the timescales, and that any output from the verification can be communicated back to that individual.
Thank you. Now, I'm going to come back to some of the words that you used in the course of that answer, Mr. Conner, just to make sure that we're all understanding exactly what's involved. Could could we go to page 91 of your statement? And at the foot of that page, you asked a question about commissioning and validation. Now, don't answer the question before I ask it, if you don't mind. I'll come back to these words just in a moment. You were trying to navigate the ZUTEC portal. Was that easy to do? We've had some evidence about ZUTEC.
Personally, I never found it that easy to interrogate ZUTEC. Essentially, it was a structured folder drop-down menu with various routes into trying to access design information, handover information, commissioning documentation. It took some time to familiarise yourself with it, and in some instances you would rely on the users of others to maybe advise how to access a particular document if it was on there.
Thank you. Now we just go to the top of page 92. I just want to ask you about the terms that we're using on that and the next sections of your statement. I'd like you just to make sure that we're understanding this correctly. Are there 3 different processes for a new ventilation system? Am I right in thinking there is commissioning, validation, and verification? Is that correct?
So for a new ventilation system, there is commissioning and validation.
Right.
Verification happens after, a year later.
Okay, so just so we're clear about what these are, commissioning, that's done by the, let me just call it the contractor for the moment. It doesn't matter whether it's a specialist or whoever. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And that's them basically making sure that what I put in is up and working.
Yes, if design says X, the commissioning engineer measures X and reports on that finding.
Now, validation is the next stage for the new system. Now, am I right in thinking that's done by the client, although often through an external expert or consultant?
Yes, that's correct.
And what's the point of validation?
The point of validation is for the health board to ensure that the design that's been installed and commissioned fits the clinical environment and aligns with the guidance outlined within 0301. It's to ensure that the ventilation strategy is in keeping with the parameters set out within the guidance document with respect to air change rates, pressure profiles, hierarchy of cleanliness.
Thank you. And that's just so you can see where you are in the sequence of your statement. That's essentially a slightly longer version of an answer you give in answer to question 36 in the middle of the page that we're looking at the moment. That's page 92.
Yes.
Is that correct?
That's correct.
So that's why it's important. And then, does validation have any connection to verification?
Yes, it does. In order to conduct a verification, the whole point of a verification is that you're verifying against the installation's original validation to see that it hasn't moved in regime, that the performance of the system hasn't drifted. So it's in its word in itself, you're verifying against that original validation.
Now, in this case, am I right in understanding that when you moved into your role in 2018, you either had a task set yourself a task of finding out what documentation on things like validation was available? Is that correct?
Yes, when I took over in April 2018, essentially it was just to continue the pre-existing maintenance regime. that already been initiated with regard to maintenance and annual verification planning. And then during that process, I believe I've tried to highlight it within my statement, that I conducted an overview of the entire ventilation asset for the Queen Elizabeth, and cross-referenced that against SHTMO 301 Part B, Appendix 2, in order to highlight what systems were critical and were recorded as critical, and what ones were general, so that the maintenance that was going to be carried out from a compliance standpoint, the frequencies would be correct, and also any verifications or plan verifications that were currently done, any ones that were not being done could be added to the list.
Well, let me ask you two questions. You have touched on this in your statement, but did you find records of validation for the ventilation systems at the Queen Elizabeth Hospital?
No.
Now, did that cause you concern when you didn't find validation?
It didn't actually cause me concern, because when I took over the ventilation in April, we had the estates team already had quite a robust, well-rehearsed verification plan in place for the theatres. And in light of not having appropriate validation documentation, any subsequent verification is directly then benchmarked against the guidance in 0301. So to look at previous verification reports and that they were benchmarked against those guidance standards demonstrated to me that they were still performing as intended for the ones that were being carried out. But yes, there's always a concern that you don't have validation documentation, I suppose, for all assets.
And
Can I just interrupt? Is just to check that my note is correct. You did not find validation records for any aspect of the ventilation system. Is that what you said to Mr. Connell?
Yes, that's correct.
However, when it came to verification, there was a program in place and recorded for verification of theatres. Is that what? Have I picked you up correctly?
Yes, you have. You have.
Right. Now, by referring to theatres, is that in contrast with other spaces within the hospital?
Yes. Within the guidance, there is an outlay of what it constitutes as a critical asset, a critical ventilation asset within the healthcare built environment. So obviously theatres are one, critical care, high dependency, MRIs, any LEV system, they also encompass the critical asset, if you like, isolation rooms. Validation information, validation you should do once and you should do it a handover, and that's when you have a performance document, if you like, for general ventilation plant and critical ventilation plant. So when I took it over and didn't see any validation information, you would have a concern that there was no validation information for the general plant. But because we had an ongoing programme for the verification of the critical plant, albeit it didn't encompass all critical assets at that point in time, you had some assurance that the higher priority items were being taken care of. There was a programme in its early iteration of conducting a verification of the isolation rooms, but there was, I think there was about 36 isolation rooms, and at that point in time, only a couple had been verified for other challenges. So kind of made it a priority to start verifying them in accordance with SHTML 301 and also SHPN Note 4 Supplement 1.
How often would you expect a critical asset, and you've given the example of critical care, high dependency unit, MRI, isolation rooms, how often would you expect a verification of the ventilation outputs in these assets to be carried out?
The guidance recommends it's done within 12 months, every 12 months, annually.
Right, every 12 months.
Yes.
So when you took over responsibility in April 2018, there, as far as you were aware, there had been no verification of the critical assets other than the theatres.
Yes, that's correct.
Right. Thank you very much. Sorry for interrupting, Mr. Conner.
When you did this exercise of essentially carrying out a check of the whole system, whole ventilation systems in the hospital, once you'd done it, what did you do with it? Who did you give it to, if anybody?
Well, the process itself was quite time consuming, and I wouldn't say laborious. It was interesting, but it took a little bit of resource in order to get that relevant information. So essentially, I would be having plant rooms surveyed to give me a list of their handling units for each plant room, the areas that they served, and then trying to assess any associated documentation for that particular unit. Collating that information onto the one place, if you like, and this is where Kerr Clarkson, my colleague at the time, was fundamental in helping me collate this information to give a complete asset overview of the ventilation from what was already there to what was actually visibly surveyed by myself and my team. Once that information was ready and available, it was, and obviously my line managers, Colin Purden at the time, and Andrew Wilson at that time, had visibility that this was an ongoing process that I was involved in. And then it was put on the estate shared drive for all to see. So it was fully visible. And it actually acted as a tool because the PPMs on the CAF FM system weren't up and running at that time. So in order to get compliance, I was aware from reading SHTML 301 that critical assets must be serviced on a quarterly basis. And the minimum requirement for compliance for a general asset is that it incurs 140-point check per calendar year. So to look at the information and the PPMs that were being returned from the pre-existing process, I was able to mark off from a compliance perspective what ones had been serviced for that year to allow me to pinpoint what areas still required PPM in order to comply with the guidance.
So you've told us that there was no validation records to be found. You told His Lordship that apart from the theatres, no verification. What did you find about maintenance? Did you find that all be maintained quarterly as required, or was there gaps?
The theatres were maintained quarterly. The documentation that was currently being issued for them was within, aligned with the frequencies you would expect. For general plant, so I found that there was no PPMs necessarily being issued for them, and there was duplication and repeat PPMs being issued. Essentially, the document set for issue to the competent persons was a folder structure on the estates drive with calendar months, and the pre-populated PPMs that were to be issued for that month. I found an overview in them that they didn't cover the full estate, and that's what gave me the ability to prioritise what was missing and what had to be done.
Apart from putting your documentation, once you'd got it finished, on the shared drive so it was there for people to see, did you do anything to escalate the fact that there was a lack of validation, a lack of verification, and not as much maintenance as required to anyone else?
Yeah, I had conversations with Colin and Andy Wilson, and they supported me in the exercise that I was carrying out to conduct that overview of the asset.
Thank you. Let's just move on for a moment, Mr. Conner. At a later stage of your statement, you were asked about the hospital opening and any issues that you were bothered about at that time, and I don't think I need delay you to take you through all of that. You highlighted in particular the pneumatic tube system, which you were a bit surprised to see was causing problems. Is that right?
I don't dispute that. I don't remember actually recording that within my statement, but I wouldn't deny that the PTS system, the pneumatic tube system, certainly opening was a challenging system to keep up and running. It suffered from continuous breakdowns. There was a significant lack of service contract support in place at that time, and very limited training and expertise with regards to it.
Well, yeah, perhaps I can just take you to page 98 of your statement. At the foot of that page, the bit about the pneumatic tube systems is a little earlier, but you've covered that in your answer. I think you say at the foot of that page you were concerned basically about the sheer scale of the building and the time that people had available to get on top of things. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
And when you talk about the specialist service contracts, what are you talking about there?
Various systems for specialist service contracts. Where did I start? Control contracts for the building management system, boiler maintenance contracts, CHP contracts. These things were put in place as a matter of urgency, I believe, by Ian Powery very early on. But initially, when they were handed over, some of them were still in the process of being put in place. Specialist verification contractors, nurse call contractors, every contractor that you would imagine that you would require to manage that size of estate and could not be carried out in-house with the existing staff. It took time to get all these contacts and agreed contracts up and running, I believe.
Thank you. You mentioned CAMF or CAMF, just so we're sure that's the system that's supposed to help you do PPM. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. Computer-aided facilities management system.
Yeah. And I just want to ask you about one thing you said about that, just so we understand the point you're making. At page 104 of your statement, near the bottom half, you talk about CAMF there at the time of handover. And just explain to us what you're telling us in that answer there about CAMF.
Sure, no problem. So the CAF FM system was a system that was adopted board-wide, I believe, maybe 3 to 4 years prior to the Queen Elizabeth coming online. So I'd had experience using it as a planning supervisor at the Western Infirmary. And how it was initially used at the Queen Elizabeth was that the users, the staff, if you like, for all the departments, would have access to the client part of the system where they could record any job requests, issues, and that would feed back to the system. On the other side of the fence, the users of the system, the supervisors and estates managers, had the ability to issue those jobs to the technicians and also to create additional tasks manually that could also be issued to carry out maintenance. The pre-population of PPM was not on the CAF FM system at that time. So essentially, any maintenance that would be being carried out was manually created and issued.
Thank you. Let me. We know from your statement that in the course of your time at the hospital, you were involved in attending to a variety of issues that arose. And I don't want to take up time asking you about all of them, but I would just like to touch on a topic that this inquiry has already had a little bit about, which is chilled beams. Now, you know what we're talking about in relation to chilled beams, is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
The section of your statement which deals with this starts at 106 at the foot. You got that?
I have that, yes.
And then you say there, you remember incidents when there was condensation dripping that had a global effect on the hospital. What do you mean by that? You mean everywhere in the hospital?
Yeah, fundamentally more than one chilled beam. It's not an isolated incident. The issues that I found with chilled beams were one of two things during my time at the hospital. The physical connections for the cooling and heating circuits that were connected to the chilled beams were...
Okay, just let me ask you to take this slowly so we follow what you're talking about. You're talking about the connections. Are these connections that carry water to the beams?
Yes, that's correct. Yes, they're push fit.
No, what was the issue there?
So they were the types of fittings that the chilled beams in essence come in two styles. The ones at the Queen Elizabeth are active chilled beams in that they're connected to a mechanical ventilation system. The batteries on the beams themselves have essentially spigots that come off of them. And that's the point of connection for the medium, whether it be chilled water or low temperature hot water. To be
just so I'm clear, Mr. Conner, I'm sorry to cut across you. This is one of the problems with remote hearing. When you talk about batteries, you're not talking about electric batteries that you put in, something like that.
No. I suppose the correct term would be coils, cooling coil or heating coil.
Right, thank you. Anyway, you were saying that they had spigots coming off them. Is that right?
Yes, the point of connection onto the battery to connect the medium was done by push fit connections, and they're not ideal. They can basically succumb to fluctuations in temperature through medium failure. So, for example, if we have a boiler failure and the temperature of the medium temperature hot water being generated drops, the system itself will cool and the pipework will contract. That contraction can breach the seal, if you like, within the push fit connector and can lead to leaks. And they're not always resealed when the temperatures are reinstated. So that was one issue with the chilled beams, the physical connection to them, the physical mechanical connection to them. The other issues that we experienced were condensation, and that is quite a rare event. It didn't happen all that often. It's something that would occur at the hospital under extreme atmospheric conditions, where the temperatures are extremely high and the levels of humidity are high. And essentially the external components of the chilled beam would have water condense onto them and drip through. There was various measures put in place to address that.
Yes, I was just about to ask you, is that something that you would have expected to have happened, or would you have expected that to have been designed out of the system?
I would have expected it to be designed out of the system, but the reality is that when you're sizing and building systems of this type, they have to be done in such a fashion where they can support the majority of conditions over the use of a year. My predecessor, Paul McAllister, had worked with Ian Powery and Schneider Controls to implement local dehumidification strategies software, so that this type of air could be cooled locally at their handling units in order to remove the moisture within the air under these conditions. So that was applied to all zones of the air handling plant, and I think that made a step change. But when I got involved with it, there was still a rare occasion where condensation could still occur. And essentially it was when the dew point of the air itself was high enough and was able to condense within the space itself. The reason for that was, and my investigations showed that under these circumstances, essentially dew point is a property of vapour pressure, and essentially it is the temperature of air when it is 100% saturated and will start to condense and start to return to water. The dehumidification strategy at the air handling units tries to cool that air down to bring it down to its dew point in order to drop the moisture out of the air prior to it being sensibly reheated and discharged to the space. But under extreme conditions, we found that the amount of cooling that was the cooling capacity for the site was not necessarily adequate to remove that moisture. So you still had, in extreme circumstances, the risk of condensation appearing on the external elements of the chill beams within the space. So I implemented with colleagues from Schneider a simple strategy to ensure that the flow temperatures, the chilled water flow temperatures associated with the chill beam circuits were always above the dew point of the air measured by the building management system by 2 degrees. So essentially, the chilling capacity of the chill beam would always be higher than that of the dew point of the air delivered to the space, hypothetically eradicating the risk of condensation. The drawback to that is that you would have difficulty continuing to cool the space. But I think at that time it was deemed that it's quite a rare event that happens, and it's the greater of two problems that's been addressed.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Conner. Just while we're still on chilled beams, if I may just ask you to look at a couple of documents to see if you can help us with them. Can we have, please, bundle 12, page 974? Can we just check that's the right one? Can we just scroll down past that page, please? I think there should be another. Chill beams, yeah. Ah, yes, I was looking to find your name, Mr. Conner, and I find it in the middle of page 975, where it said a rapid high scribe was put in place, signed by Darryl. That'll be you, is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
And if we go then from that document to page 108 of your statement, you're being asked about this document, and you explain this is to do with the issues, and your job was to get something sorted out fairly quickly. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
And this business of the connections not being ideal or failing under certain conditions, was that a one-off, or was that found elsewhere in the hospital estate?
No, that was found elsewhere in the hospital estate pretty much from day one. All um, all radiant panels, all chill beams, anything that would be a wet service, if you like, or a closed loop service within the rooms was pretty much connected by flexes. There was from pretty much from handover, the builder was in carrying out a retrospective changing of all these flexi hoses for compression type. That was quite a long and lengthy process. But when I had conducted investigations and improvement works through various wards within the hospital, our surveys showed that they hadn't all been changed and that the flexi connections still existed. In this instance, 6A, we changed out all of the flexible connections within Ward 6A to compression type in order to minimise that leakage risk.
Yeah, I was about to ask you that, because the document we looked at a moment ago, it dates from September 2019. So the hospital has been open for some considerable time by the time you're finding this problem. Is that correct?
Yes.
And can I ask you just one other thing about that? If we go to the next page of your statement 109, in the first paragraph, you say there you don't think there was an awareness that chill beams are closed circuit sealed systems. This means that the quality of water in pipework is not the same standard as consumable domestic standard at a sink tap or shower head. What's the point you're trying to make there?
So there was a concern. I remember at the time there was a concern of the water that was leaking from the chill beam, and that it could present some microbiological risk. And essentially, domestic water that's fit for consumption, wholesome or potable, if you like, goes through a far different process with regards to filtration and dosing and all the other associated water management that's conducted by others. But the closed loop systems itself are essentially radiator circuits. And when I say radiator circuits, that could be heating or chilling circuits. They're sealed systems to provide the transfer of energy, either heating or cooling, from one space to another. They are dosed with inhibitors or glycols in order to keep the systems pressurised, but they are not under optimum operating conditions. They would never be within the space because they're not leaking; they're sealed. I think that was the point I was trying to make. Sorry.
And what then leaks is not filtered potable water designed for any particular patient group. It's simply water that's had inhibitors and other things put in it, so you don't really know what conditions it's in. Is that right?
Yes, it's not something that would be generally tested, and if it did leak, you wouldn't expect it to be of the same standard of the water that came out of a tap or a shower head. You wouldn't expect it to be clean because it's a sealed system.
Thank you. Can I ask you, and it's just to see whether you can help us at all with this, can I ask you to look at bundle 10 at page 197? Now, I'll tell you, this is a meeting of minute of a meeting of a water technical group in July 2020. And if you can't help us with this, please say so. If you see in the second paragraph, there's a note, there's an emerging issue with a high rate of failure on the chilled water system, which is the one we've just been talking about 80 failures. It's a note that Ian Parry had previously discovered the stainless steel might be different, and so on. Do you know anything about the emerging issue of failures on the chilled water system?
I don't know anything directly about it. I was aware there was an investigation going on with regards to different types of materials used within the systems, dissimilar metals, areas of corrosion within the system that were being inspected, photographed and collated.
So you're aware of it happening, but you weren't directly involved?
Sorry, that would be the best way to put it.
Is that a fair summary?
Yep.
If I put questions to you like that, Mr. Conner, and you don't agree, please don't hesitate just to say that's not correct, just so we keep ourselves clear. But thank you for that. And in fact, I think it becomes clear from your statement that water wasn't your main concern, where certainly to the extent the ventilation was. Is that fair?
That's correct.
Are we moving away from chilled beams?
We are.
Could I just ask for your help, really, just to make sure I'm following things and understanding it? You described the chilled beams in the Queen Elizabeth as active chilled beams, right?
Yes.
I think I had got it into my mind that they were passive chilled beams, so I'm wrong about that. We're talking about an active chilled beam system.
Yes, that's correct.
Right. And the other thing is, from previous evidence, I think I've understood, but tell me if I'm wrong about this, that at least at one time, the problem of condensation on the chilled beam had its origin in a disabling or turning off of the dew point control. Now, maybe I should, I have understood, and I may be entirely wrong about this, Mr. Conner, that the dew point, the point of the dew point control is that it's an automatic system which, once the ambient temperature in the hospital reaches a certain level, the chill beams are automatically switched off. Now, is that right or wrong?
That wasn't what I found. That wasn't what my investigations showed.
I appreciate you've told us something else. So, would I be wrong in what I've just said?
No, that would be one way of controlling it. You're not wrong.
But was it a way of controlling it at the time you took over responsibility?
No, not that I could see.
Right.
When I got involved in that, the flow to the chill beams wasn't something that was switched off. If it had been switched off under that type of control strategy, then you wouldn't have condensation appearing. That would be my understanding of that. Mm-hmm. The control strategy that's implemented through the building management system should broadly deal with that type of condition. However, under these circumstances, it was important to maintain the temperature of the external elements of the chill beam to be that above of the dew point. Right.
And what I understood from your evidence was that when you realized in what you describe as extreme, very warm weather, there was a problem of condensation, and you solved it by what I'm understanding is an adjustment which ensured that the temperature of the water within the closed chill beam system was always 2 degrees above the dew point.
Yes, when I was working with one of the colleagues for Schneider, we came up, it was a very simple solution. Essentially, it was to install a dew point sensor, an external dew point sensor outside one of the main plant rooms at plant room 31, just to give a constant definitive measure of the dew point that could be fed in to govern the flow rate, if you like, of the secondary side of the plate heat exchangers for the chill beam circuit, because the dew point control or the dehumidification strategies were being controlled at source on their handling units, and would be independently controlled as per the software. This was something that would be over and above that, and it was to essentially just take all risk out of the ability for those beams to condense under any condition. That was my goal.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lord. I'm going to be able to move on through your statement now, Mr. Conner, because we've dealt with a number of issues. You touched briefly on thermal wheels, but you've given some brief evidence on that in your statement. I don't think I need to get you to read it out. And then the discussion we had earlier about the task that you set yourself in 2018, just for the record, we find that dealt with on page 126 of your statement. When you talk about consolidating an accurate documentation inventory, that's the phrase you use at that point. And again, because we've already dealt with that, I won't go back over it. And you mentioned the importance of SHTM at page 128. So if I can just move on to one or two specifics about ventilation in the hope that I can finish with that topic shortly. You were asked a number of questions about particular areas of ventilation within the hospital estate. If we could go to 135.
Sorry, my visibility of the documentation has dropped off. I'm just trying to reconnect it just now.
Thank you. Well, let me see if I can help you while that is being attended to. You were asked about particular ventilation areas, and you say in an answer that Ward 6A you understood was being used as a general ward, and then it was later intended as a decant ward for 2A. You remember that event at least?
I do, yes.
And you then lay out what you would have expected to find both for a general ward and also a ward cohort labelled as neutropenic. I probably don't need to wait for the technology for us at that point. If the technology works, it can come with us to page 137. How's it doing now?
I can see that.
Thank you very much. And what we've got there is a paragraph that starts actually on a previous page. We didn't go there because you were talking about the desire to understand what systems there were and how they were operating. And then you say about half a dozen lines into 137 that you were involved in option appraisals for 6A and 4C. Now, 6A we've just heard about. It was a general ward that was to be used as a decant for 2A. What were you involved in for 6A?
So initially for 6A, I was originally involved when the decant was taking place. in preparation for the decant taking place, there was a large hive of activity, estates activity within the Ward 6A. My role at that time was to ensure that the air handling units that served 6A were serviced with clean filters and correctly working. The option appraisals that I carried out were during the occupancy of 6A after the decant had taken place. And I think there was an awareness that it wasn't necessarily designed specifically for that type of patient application, and that there was significant restrictions and challenges within the inbuilt parameters of the hospital for that ward to meet that of the requirement for a neutropenic patient cohort. So I was tasked to come up with an option appraisal to discuss ventilation improvements, risk reducing measures, and an option study to see what could be carried out to essentially make the environment to make it safer, to make it as good as it could be without complete rebuild, without complete plant replacement, although that was one of the options on the option appraisal.
And what did you do with that option appraisal? Who did it go to?
So I sent that option appraisal to Alan Gallagher, Colin Purden, and Tom Steele.
Okay. And what about 4C? Do you know what the patient cohort was in 4C?
I believe it was adult hemat-oncology. I could be wrong there.
And
it was a very similar option appraisal.
A similar option appraisal. I think, in fairness to you, about halfway down that very long paragraph, you'll see 4C appears. We say my actions would be, say, for 4C, and then you set out what these were. And a similar option appraisal there, is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
And the conclusion that you put at the end of this section is you say you provided option appraisals. So can we just get clear, you provided the appraisals, but somebody else decided what happened, is that right?
Yes, it was a group decided what happened. This option appraisal was essentially an engineering option appraisal, and that was taken to a table where these options were discussed, and then I was informed by, I think Alan told me what one was to be carried out. And obviously I can remember what was carried out and what we did over a duration of time.
What was done in 4C, can you remember?
Yes, so 4C, prior to that taking place, there had been some rebalancing works of the ventilation systems carried out within the hospital. 4C was essentially to get the specialist contractor to provide us with a survey of the rooms within the ward to demonstrate the measured air change rates that were seen and the pressure profiles from the patient room to corridor, and whether they were positive or whether they were negative. Once we had that, the goal was to try and make them positive because it was a hemat-oncology patient cohort. So moderate rebalancing to that system was carried out in order to achieve that. The pressure cascades that were recorded, and I can't remember the reports, but they were notionally positive. 1 to 2 Pascals positive eventually from room to corridor. Other improvements were carried out within those patient rooms over the course of time, individually carried out under HEI scribe agreed by infection control, to install ensuite ceiling mounted HEPA filters. We also carried out inspection of the IPS panels within the en-suites to inspect the wet surfaces and to see if there was any ingress or dampness within those areas.
IPS means?
Inspection Services Panel. It's essentially a cabinet within the ensuite where the sink's attached to it, and you can lift off the top panel and inspect the chamber behind it where the wet services and pipe connections exist. So it was all about looking at them, making sure they were clean, clear, damp-free. Any fabric within the space would be repaired. There was an installation of door drop-downs to help encourage being able to achieve a pressure profile within the space. The ward corridors themselves had ceiling vent grills, which are essentially just blank grills, louvered grills that sit within the corridor spaces. They were removed and replaced by standard ceiling tiles. And then there was a subsequent kind of re-verification report that demonstrated the levels of secondary air change rate that the ensuite HEPA filters were providing, because what they did was essentially scrub the air that was already delivered to the space within the ensuite.
Can I ask?
Sorry, I missed that last detail. It was just a lack of attention on my part. Could you just repeat your last answer, please, Mr. Conner?
Sure. We installed ceiling-mounted HEPA filters within the en-suites. Those units were significantly oversized for the volume of the en-suite itself. They incorporated charcoal and H14 HEPA filters, and it's important to note that they weren't filtering the air for these spaces from source, but they were scrubbing and cleaning the secondary air that had already been delivered to the space. So the concept was to lower the level of particulate within the room itself, and this was also aided by the deployment and use of a portable mobile HEPA filter. The information, when the project was completed, we had a verification report that would demonstrate what the pressure profiles looked like post-works, what the recorded air change rates were, and I suppose there was two additional improvements that were made also to the air handling units that serve these areas. So in the instance of 4C, there was 3 air handling units that were located up in level 12 plant room that were essentially served levels 4 to 7 within that core of the building. So at source, the secondary filtration within the air handling unit was upgraded to a higher level efficiency filter. So we went from what they would call at the time F7 to F9. And also there was some rebalancing of the plant to lift the load currents of the motors to maximum load current to provide as much additional air volume as possible in order to optimise pre-existing substandard air change rates.
Am I right in thinking, Mr. Conner, that there, among the options for 4C, and tell me if I'm wrong, was not the kind of change you're talking about, but complete rebuild of the ventilation systems?
That was one of my options, yes.
And you end the section of your statement that we're looking at the moment by saying this: you provide options appraisals for my line manager's consideration and review to try and optimize the ventilation strategy to suit the clinical environment. Then you say, with the understanding that it did not meet the outgoing guidance standards for that of a general or immune compromised setting. Can you just explain what you mean by it didn't meet standards?
Yeah, so within the technical memorandum appendix 2, it states that the required air change rate for a general ward is 6 air changes per hour, and for a neutropenic patient cohort, it should be at that time under 2014 guidance, 10 air changes per hour. The recorded air changes that we've seen under that survey were in keeping with what we'd seen for the rest of the areas that were surveyed, of between 2.5 and 3 air changes per hour. The limitation of those air change rates for those rooms has obviously been widely discussed by others, but fundamentally, from what I could see, it was about plant capacity, and also with chill beams being the delivery of air within the patient room itself. They are limited to the amount of air volume that you can put through them. I believe the ones at the Queen Elizabeth were rated for 40 litres per second, and that's about 14.5 metres cubed per hour, and based on that room volume would give you an air change rate of between 2 and 3 air changes per hour. So what I was basically saying is that it wouldn't align with the recommended air change rates for both general and neutropenic as per SHTMO 301.
Could you remind me, Mr. Conner, of the date of your option appraisals for 6A and 4C?
I can't remember the dates of when I carried them out. And I know that the documents should still exist and perhaps sit with the estates team. They're there for visibility, but I believe it was between, I think it was 2019 to 2020. I can't remember the exact date, I'm sorry.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lord. I'm going to move on to what I hope is my final question or questions about ventilation, Mr. Conner, and that's about the work done on Ward 2A, where we know that a more, well, let me call it a more radical solution was adopted involving much more work to the ventilation systems for that ward, and I think you'll remember that. Is that so?
Yes, that's correct.
And I think just so we pick this up in your witness statement, if we go to 144, I didn't get you to read through this, but I see near the foot of that page, you talk about a complete plant replacement of all systems was to be carried out, and then you say what that was to try to achieve. You see that near the foot of that page?
I did, and then, yes, I do, yep.
And then, am I right in understanding from your subsequent answers that you were involved in helping to develop the specification for what should be provided in 2A once it was up and running with its new kit?
Yes, at one point I did get involved in providing what I thought the client specification should look like for that ward. Initially, when the original concept of refurnishment was being discussed, I sat alongside Ian Powrie, the capital team, and Matt Lambert.
Mr. Lambert of IDS, the external advisor, is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
Thank you. So you were with Mr. Powrie and Mr. Lambert, and you said the capital team? Yes,
the representatives of the capital team, and I sat there as an authorised person for ventilation. That was my role. As the design progressed, and obviously Ian had retired, I was involved. I had sight of what the development of the design looked like, and the capital team would provide regular sharing of what the design intent was to the operational estates team, being both myself, Alan Gallagher, and I think the whole thing was kind of governed by Jerry Cox, who was assistant director at the time. So yeah, that's
So you were involved. I think you say on page 145, halfway through the answer in the second half of the page, that you voiced your opinion about compliance standards. Is that what your input to the discussions was focused on?
yes. So the original design refurnishment proposal was to only carry out the works to the TCT, the Teenage Cancer Trust aspect of the ward, and the HEMAT oncology part. The bone marrow transplant aspect of the ward, at that time was not, it didn't form part of these refurnishment works. And my concerns were around the fact that you could argue that that was a higher clinical datum than perhaps the other two areas, but that would be for the clinical and infection control teams to kind of confirm that. And there was obviously some shortfalls in the existing design of those isolation rooms, and the corridors themselves that were served from shared air handling plant. And there was stuff around the level of filtration and the ability to actually service that filtration. So these were some of the things that concerns that I'd raised at meetings. And obviously you can see by my evidence that Jerry had asked me to provide a specification for what I thought that ventilation strategy should look like for that ward. So I prepared that, not by myself. It was myself that led it. I had additional support from the AP at the time, Jim Guthrie, Hugh Brown, and I think I had the authorising engineer's input also, Jamie Manhinnock, and I also had our specialist contractor, Ian McKenzie, helping me look at relevant industry standards, current guidance and up and coming guidance to provide that recommendation of what would be an optimum patient environment for that patient cohort.
Yeah, I think you were asked the question, your questionnaire, having explained some of this material, you said, well, were your suggestions taken on board? And am I right in saying that you say you think they were, but ultimately you had left before the vision that you'd been discussing had actually been built?
So yes, that's correct. There was the revision that if the first version of the client specification was Ian's, the second one would have been mine, and then I believe there was other iterations of the design prior to me submitting that one and after I left. But I think there was an openness and a mindset within everybody that was involved to provide an extremely modern and usable facility. And I do believe a lot of those things were taken on board. I wasn't involved with the validation or handover of the project, so I don't know what was finally delivered. But I think it would be a significant facility over what was pre-existing.
Thank you very much. I'm about to leave ventilation, my lord, in case my lord has any further questions.
No, thank you.
Thank you. I just have one more topic to raise with you, Mr. Conner. I might just ask a couple of preliminary questions about it before we come into some of the detail. I want to ask you about cryptococcus and pigeons.
Okay.
Now, based on what you say in your statement, am I right in understanding that if there was an issue with pigeon or pigeon infestation or pigeon droppings or whatever it happened to be, fixing that could be instructed by a variety of people, not simply by one designated person? Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And can you tell us, and please say if you can't, whether anyone was, as it were, in control of checking what Pigeon issues were cropping up and what was being done?
I don't know.
You know?
I don't know. I would say that the fact that various people can report ingress or vermin from all facets of the soft and hard FM facilities, whether it be through help desks, individuals reporting it FM first, or personally witnessing it. The fact that the third party contractor, if you like, comes out and carries out those works, I don't know who would actually sit to monitor all that. I do believe it is soft FM, it's the facilities team that generally deal with it, but I think at that time the requests for these types of jobs and cleans were not necessarily centrally managed. That's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah. The reason I'm just conscious of time, Lord, before I go any further. We're just about at 11:30. If this would be an appropriate juncture.
Well, I'm in your hands, Mr. Connell.
Well, I'm content that this is as good a point as any.
Take a break. Mr. Connell, we usually take about 20 minutes for a coffee break in the morning, and we'll do that now. Could I ask you to be back at your screen for 10 to 12?
Yes, no problem.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Right, we'll take a break.
My Lord, as we wait for Mr.
Right.
Conner, as he has now joined us, but I've been asked to make it clear that there seems to be an error in communications to core participants about the decision to slot Mr. Conner's evidence in today. And apparently they hadn't been advised of that, which has led to a number of discussions about questions during the break that would otherwise have been done much earlier. So I thought I'd better advise the inquiry openly that an error had been made on that front.
Right. I mean, have you managed to deal with that, or do you want
No,
a longer break? Or?
I have most of the questions that I need. We'll perhaps do a final check at the end, but hopefully we can still deal with it as scheduled.
Right. Okay, so we'll continue with Mr. Conner.
Yeah. I have a preliminary question.
Give you a break.
Yes, yeah. I have a preliminary question, Mr. Conner. Perhaps you can help us. One of the challenges of doing this remotely is that we're here and you're there, and we can see you, but other than the Venetian blinds in the room, we can't see anything else. Have you been receiving emails during the course of your evidence? Because we were hearing pinging and from time to time.
No, I haven't received any emails. If I have, I haven't checked them.
Thank you. But let me just see if I can. I'm going to have to come back on a number of issues that I've been asked to touch on afresh, Mr. Conner. But let me see if I can just deal with the cryptococcus issue. Am I right in understanding from your witness statement at page 150 that you didn't really know anything about cryptococcus in pigeons at the time that you were an estate manager in 2018?
Yes, that's correct. I'd never heard of cryptococcus in my life.
And I think you asked that. I think you asked at 151, had you ever heard of it before? And your answer is simply no. You'd not come across it.
That's correct.
I asked you some questions just before the break about how work to deal with pigeons or pigeon excrement or whatever were instructed, and you confirmed that it could be instructed by a number of people. The information I have, Mr. Conner, is that there were instructions about and reports of difficulties with pigeons going back to 2015 and onwards from there. Do you know anything about that?
I'm aware that there's been an ongoing issue with pigeons since the hospital opened. I do remember one of my site managers, David Bratty, requesting GP Environmental to carry out remedial works with regards to pigeons and ingress within the hospital plant rooms in the past.
When you say in the past, can you remember when that was?
I think it was certainly between, it could be as early as 2016, but I can't be certain. I do know that it was with respect to the children's hospital plant room.
Right. The reason I ask the questions, and it may be you can't help beyond your second-hand knowledge of this, is that a lot of the material the inquiry has about pigeon and cryptococcus focuses on the period in 2018 come into 2019. But your understanding was that these problems with pigeon ingress, for instance, into plant rooms date back well before that.
Yes, I don't know whether within plant rooms, but certainly around the courtyards of plant rooms. I don't have good detail or overview to comment on what was previously dealt with. I didn't have much involvement with it during that time period.
Thank you. And in fact, I think on page 151 of your statement that you say you could count on one hand the occasions when I would call out GP Environmental. That's the pest control company.
That's
right?
correct, yes.
And on the odd occasions you were involved, what were you calling them out for?
And the occasions that I was calling them out for would have been for pigeon droppings, or I think that's the only time I've ever called them.
And why was that something that concerned you sufficiently to call in a contractor?
So in November and December 2018, Andrew Wilson had asked me to carry out an exercise to recommission, or not to recommission, but to rebalance some of their handling plants within the hospital, to provide dedicated pressure profiles for the rooms. That included wards 4C, 5D, 7D, and another one. Perhaps 4C as well, maybe I mentioned that. But the specialist contractor who was carrying out these rebalancing works was accessing and working on the plant in level 12 plant room, and he sent me an email bringing to my attention there was dead birds and pigeon droppings within the plant room. So that's what called me to. Well, actually, when I got sight of that, I delegated that to an estate supervisor to request that GP Environmental should be called out to carry out a clean-up. And that was generally standard practice. If you have a report, or if it's reported through FM First, or it's mentioned, or it's visibly seen, then you would contact them.
Okay, we'll just stick at 151 near the foot of the page. You've already told us you really didn't know anything about cryptococcus, and then you say here you were told by Ian Powery that someone had passed away and cryptococcus was one hypothesis. You knew nothing about it, but you were asked to go and survey all the plant rooms, which you then did. Is that correct?
Yes, that evening I was asked to go and survey the plant room on level 12 of the adult hospital. So I printed off a drawing, an A1 drawing, and took it up to the plant room and systematically walked through all the plant rooms, marking up on the drawing where I could see any pigeon droppings or ingress, and essentially just marked it on the drawing, highlighted it for ease of third-party visibility, and signed and dated it to record when that was carried out. And then came back to the office, and I believe I maybe scanned it and then emailed it to certainly Colin and Ian the following day.
And at that time, when you were checking to see what could be found, was there much to be found, or not very much, or what was the general picture?
It's hard to quantify what would be much, as in nothing at all would be zero, but certainly one of the plant rooms had more droppings in it than others. I found through my walkthrough there was sporadic dottings of droppings through all the plant rooms in level 12, but it was more of a kind of a peppermint, if you like. But the plant room 1, 2, 3, which served core D of the hospital, that had the largest concentration of pigeon droppings at the end of the plant room, next to the plant room door, and in the middle space, if you like, between two of their handling units. I think I highlighted it on my drawing as a kind of big box.
Yeah, and I think you point out at 153 of your statement that to clean that wasn't just a question of sending somebody out with a bucket of water. It actually involved protective equipment and a specialist contractor and so on. Is that correct?
Yes, the representative from GP Environmental, I believe his name is Alan Bryden, he explained to the estate, well, Colin and myself, and perhaps Ian, the measures that they would need to take about how they would deal with the clean, by neutralising the pigeon droppings, by treating them with biocide, and then obviously they would have to submit a risk assessment and method statement outlining their protective measures and personal protective equipment in order to carry out that task. And that pretty much from that day forwards started a full clean of all plant rooms for an ongoing, quite a long duration of time, top to bottom.
I think you've been asked in the course of your statement to look at a report that GP Environmental did in January 2019, and I think you said when you read it, nothing surprised you, but you hadn't actually seen it until more recently. Is that fair?
That's fair, yeah.
And I think we'll find that at Bundle 24, Volume 1, page 115. And this is a report which talks about a significant health and safety issue.
Yes.
Just so I'm clear, you hadn't seen that until when you were being asked questions for the purpose of your statement?
Yeah, I seen this document, I believe it was on Monday. I think it was either requested on Friday that there was an additional document to review. It was either Friday or Monday Friday of last week or Monday of this week. I was asked to look at this document. I think it outlines the helipad and the adjacent walkways from the helipad, doesn't it?
Okay. Well, just for the record, it's dealt with on page 153 of your statement, when you pointed out it was addressed to Karen Connolly, and you didn't recall reading it, but what you saw tended to support what you knew of the response from GP Environmental.
Yes, that's correct.
And do you know what they were doing, GP Environmental, apart from sending in reports pointing out that the risk? What were they asked to do? Did they do any physical work as opposed to cleaning?
I believe they were doing trying to implement control of the problem of pigeons. I remember hearing verbally that they would be setting traps, capturing them, removing them kind of environmentally safely and humanely, treating areas that were soiled, cleaning them. I don't know the exact detail. The GP Environmental were on site for a long time dealing with this issue, and I didn't have sight of what their daily routine was and the specific aspects of what they were doing, what they were carrying out. I just know that their remit was to deal with the survey and the control of the pigeon problem within the campus, essentially.
Thank you. Can I ask you about one specific thing that you do seem to have been involved with? You were asked to show Dr. Christine Peters the level 12 plant rooms. I think you were asked that by Mr. Powery, according to your statement at page 155.
Yes.
Do you remember that?
Yes, I do remember that.
Do you remember when this was done? There seemed to be some debate as to why it was in the evening or whether it was in the evening.
I can't remember when it was done, and I don't necessarily recall it being in the evening. I don't dispute that it was, but I think the reasoning behind it was just when it was possible for Ian, Christine and myself to all be in attendance to carry out that visit.
And one issue of some controversy seems to be that it is said that you didn't tell Dr. Peters that you had a lot of photographs taken at different times of different places showing pigeon droppings. Now, can you remember, did you have access to these photographs at the time of that visit?
I don't remember that I had access to them. I had been involved in the collation of all sorts of evidence with regards to the investigation, whether it be pictures taken, layout drawings, service records. I was instructed by Colin Purdon that any information was to be collated and put onto a designated folder on the estate shared drive that would be shared on its completion with all relevant people. So the sharing of that information I was not tasked with. It wasn't for me to do.
I suppose the question is, Dr. Peters is there presumably wearing an infection control hat, and you know that there's this material, it's not necessarily yours or yours alone. The question might come to be, well, in order to give the infection control team the best picture of what was in place, would it not have been appropriate to mention that to her?
Perhaps, but I was in attendance with Ian Powery at the time as well. Ian was my line manager in that setting, and any requests of that nature from a governance perspective would have went from Christine, or should have went from Christine, from her to him. My role for that was to facilitate that meeting, because I had access to the plant rooms through keys. I knew where the equipment was, and I knew I'd already surveyed the areas of fouling that I could see.
Well, I suppose we better just check we're all talking about the same thing. Can I ask you to look at bundle 12 at 1238? And then at 1239. The first picture, I'm told, shows a dead pigeon, and the second one shows with some droppings, and the second one shows quite a lot of pigeon fouling, whatever phrase you want to use. Are you familiar with these photographs? And where did they come from?
I don't know where the dead pigeon was. The one with the main fouling at the end of the plant room, that certainly looks like plant room 123, 4D.
Do you know who took these two? Just tell me if you don't.
I don't. It may have been myself, it may have been GP Environmental, it may have been Colin Purdon, or anybody who had access to the plant room that was involved in the control of it at the time. I know I certainly did take pictures that were put onto the shared drive within that folder, but I don't know exactly what ones. I do remember photographing that myself personally, but I don't know if that particular picture is mine.
Thank you.
Just for my note, you said that the second photograph you were shown looked like plant room 123, and then did you give a further definition?
Core D.
4D.
Core D. Core D. Tower D, if you like.
Or D. Thank you.
Now, I just want to look very briefly at some other pictures, Mr. Conner, just so we make sure we know what we're talking about. Can we have bundle 27, volume 2, page 20, please? Now I'm just taking that as the first picture. In fact, on that expansion of the photograph, it becomes a little bit blurred, but it appears to show pigeon droppings on top of some piece of plant. First of all, have you seen that before?
I haven't seen that picture before. I've seen it on the review of the evidence for the purpose of this inquiry, but I haven't seen that picture before or in real life.
I'm just trying to understand what the collation of photographs was that you remember. Do you remember now what was in that collation of photographs, or do you not?
The collection of photographs was any areas where pigeon droppings were within the plant rooms.
Yeah.
So it was essentially to get the biggest picture possible for where this ingress existed within the plant rooms, and if it was on any of the equipment.
So you don't recognise document 20. What about 21? That's maybe not very clear. Let's move on to 22. I suppose some evidence of pigeon droppings on something, but do you recognise these other than having been asked to look at them very recently?
No, I don't.
23.
That looks like wouldn't be able to know what plant room that is, because the plant rooms are all physically laid out in a similar fashion, each fork of the plant room, but it does look to be one of the supporting cross beams between an H beam on the external elevation of one of the plant rooms.
Yeah. So you know what it is. Is it something you recollect being part of the collected photographs at the time, or is it simply something you've seen because you've been asked to look at it for the purposes of your evidence today?
It's seen for the purpose of the evidence today. I'm not surprised to see it though, because there was a vast collation of pictures of this collected, but this is the first time I've seen that.
No. Well, I'm not going to ask you about the others. Lord, I'm about to leave pigeons for the moment. Can I turn the clock back a little bit to earlier in your evidence, please? A number of issues have cropped up. Can I ask you, first of all, you remember in relation to Ward 2A, where a completely new system, let me just use that phrase, was put in, or was being put in. You were involved in various discussions about it, and then you left before that project was completed. You remember that evidence earlier?
Yes, I do.
Are you able to help us, or are you able to tell us who might be able to help us about any question of whether NSS Assure proposed to visit the rebuilt and refunctioned 2A ventilation system once it was all done, and what response there was to that suggestion from the board, if any?
I can't, but I could say that if you wanted to know the answer to that question, yeah, you could speak to Thomas Roger, who's head of engineering for NHS Scotland Assure. He would be able to advise on that request better than I. And also the pre-existing estates team at the Queen Elizabeth. I believe Hugh Brown is in charge of the ventilation at the hospital there. He would be able to advise whether that request is being carried out.
At various points of your statement, you mentioned the importance of SHTM 0301.
Yes.
When you started to look into what the condition was of the ventilation system at the Queen Elizabeth Hospital, having SHTM 0301 in mind, when you were discussing these issues, did you hit any resistance to using SHTM 0301 as the yardstick for looking at ventilation systems in healthcare?
No, I did not. It was expected and is expected from the estates operatives within the Queen Elizabeth that anybody working in any prospective discipline, that the technical memorandum is guidance, but for operational estates personnel, it's pretty much the Bible for what the requirements are and how you should shape and conduct your maintenance. So
Okay.
I never had, there's an expectation, I would say, that you would refer to it and use it. I wouldn't say that I was met with any resistance in using it or trying to access it. And in some instances, if you had queries about certain issues, bearing in mind that as you're working, you're gaining experience and you're encountering different things, and your training's being increased as time goes on, you would consult your line managers who would point you to certain aspects of guidance as well.
Thank you. Can I ask you to look at page 98 of your statement? And I apologise in advance, I'm jumping about a bit, but that's the nature of the exercise. Page 98, actually you can see that near the foot of the section we're looking at the moment. Large A, this is difficult to say without knowing, you see that?
Yes, I can see that.
Now, this is where you were having a look round hospital early on.
Yes.
And you're saying, well, was there anything missing? And you say, well, that's difficult to say without knowing what was contractually agreed. You say, at a glance, areas that were deemed as complete and ready for occupancy looked visually complete and tidy, but this was not an indication of the correct functionality of the system within these areas. What's the point you're trying to make there?
So the point I'm trying to make there is that you can walk through a department and it looks clean, tidied, it's had its builders clean, it's had its pre-clean for occupancy. It has a veneer of looking complete, and to the naked eye and the person walking through it, it would appear that it looks ready. But from a project perspective and a commissioning perspective, nobody would have any visibility. Well, you wouldn't, as somebody who's occupying that space and had not been involved in the process, you won't know. You have no way of knowing at that time whether it's been commissioned. You know, you could walk into a room with no lights on and not know whether the lights might well be in situ, but you don't know whether they work properly. You know, you can see a nurse call indicator sitting above a door, but unless you go up and actually physically press the remote indicator at the patient's bedside, you're not going to know whether it works or whether it alarms back at the nurse's station. So essentially, you don't know if all the commissioning and due diligence is taking place just through walking and familiarising yourself with a particular department.
Okay. Thank you. Can I ask you a general question, Mr. Conner? We discussed validation, and we discussed the idea that it was done once. And am I right in thinking the idea is that the client, if you like, has to know whether it's okay to take on that system because it's meeting what they want? Is that a fair summary?
I would say that's a fair summary, yes.
Now, should that being the case, should patients be put into a hospital which hasn't been validated?
I think that would be, without not trying to answer the question, I think that would be a decision for the clinical and infection control team to be satisfied that that information is available to them, to demonstrate and provide that assurance that they can occupy these areas with confidence. Are you asking my personal opinion?
Well, I'm just trying to understand, what the consequence might be if somebody is coming along to a new hospital with the intention of putting patients into it.
Yes.
Should that be done without satisfying yourself that validation is in place, in your view?
In my view, validation has to take place. Without appropriate validation from a ventilation perspective, you've no way to know evidentially that the system performs as intended by design. You've no evidence for it to demonstrate that it meets the requirements outlined within the guidance.
Can I ask you another general question? And as with all of these, if you're unable to answer, please just tell me and we'll explain why. When you started to review the overall ventilation systems as part of your exercise, you were basically trying to find out what was there. And can you remember whether there were HEPA filters where you anticipated there should be HEPA filters, or can you not?
I would say it was a learning experience for me to understand what constituted an isolation room, the different types of isolation rooms that were available at the Queen Elizabeth Hospital, and then the clinical requirement or selection to have these fitted with HEPA filters. So in the instance, the guidance talks about HEPA filtration being a requirement for a neutropenic patient cohort. So in the instance of like the BMT within 2A, they would have terminal HEPA filtration installed on them. So that would be in keeping with what you'd expect. But there is other positive pressure ventilated lobby isolation rooms within the campus, which didn't necessarily have HEPA filters fitted to them at the time. I believe the selection of what rooms were to have terminal HEPA installed and what ones weren't were agreed prior to my arrival on site.
Can I ask you one or two questions? And I want to be careful about separating these out. They're all about the involvement of infection control in issues relating to ventilation. When you discovered there was no validation, do you know if that was shared by you or anyone else with the infection control team?
I don't know if it was shared by anybody else by the infection control team.
Did you share it with the infection control team?
No.
When we talked about Ward 4C and your options, different types of options, ranging from complete replacement of the ventilation system onwards, that wasn't done. Something less than that was done. That's what you were telling us.
Yes.
Do you know who in infection control signed off on the ultimately selected option for 4C?
I don't know who signed off on that. The option appraisal that I generated, I submitted to Alan and Tom, and then I was told by Alan after it had been reviewed what option was to be carried out. Sorry, Alan Gallagher.
Alan Gallagher and Tom Steele.
Yes.
And on 4C, which you described as less than completely compliant, as I think you put it. I can find the exact words if we need to be with the requirements, but what was available with working within the existing systems broadly. If it's less than compliant with SHTM 0301, do you know whether any formal derogation process was gone through to record and check that?
Not to my knowledge. That's not to say that derogations weren't retrospectively drawn up. I do remember derogations were a thing from an estate's perspective. They were relatively new in my experience. I remember the first one that was created was around the new ICE building. With regards to 4C and what we're speaking about, I don't know the answer to that.
Mr. Connell, just for my benefit, when you're asking the witness in relation to whether there was any derogation in place in respect of 4C, are you referring back to a period before handover of the hospital, or are you thinking about the work which Mr. Conner has described
No, the fault.
he doing, I think, in 2018.
The fault is mine, my lord, and perhaps I should re-ask the question of Mr. Conner so we're absolutely clear. What I was referring to there, Mr. Conner, was the evidence you gave us about having prepared option appraisals and for an option ultimately having been selected, which I think you described in your witness statement as not fully compliant with guidance, but, if you like, working within what was available at the time. And I think my question was, if the resultant system was not fully compliant with SHTM 0301, whether you knew anything about any formal process for derogation. And is your answer that you don't know what was done about that?
Yes, that's my answer. For me, and how it's explained and defined within the current outgoing version of the guidance, essentially derogation would indicate that it's of betterment or equivalence as if the guidance had been followed itself. So for me, derogation probably necessarily wouldn't fit that. What it should be is a risk assessment, and that's how it should be captured as a risk assessment. The option appraisal that was submitted would have been taken to a table where I believe that risk assessment would have taken place, taking into account these factors prior to me being authorised by my line management to commence and carry out these risk reducing measures.
And were you involved in the carrying out of any risk assessment as to the options selected for 4C?
I don't believe I was.
Another technical question about 4C. You told us about the insertion of additional HEPA filters.
Yes.
Was there to be any form of validation of these HEPA filters as part of the process of installing them in 4C?
So to my knowledge, there wasn't a great deal of knowledge of the use of mobile HEPA filters around the time prior to the Queen Elizabeth Estates team procuring lots of them in support of these patient environments and to reduce the risks that were known within these areas. So a lot of it was relied on the manufacturer's recommendations and data sheets provided by the manufacturer who was Camphil. Within that, the reason these units themselves were selected over other market ones at the time was their ability to indicate when the filters had soiled and would require a service. So from an estate's perspective, it was a relatively easy thing to manage in the sense that you would have an asset register of all the mobile HEPA filters and where they were deployed and have somebody check them on a weekly basis to see what the condition was of the service light and if they would require a filter change or not. I think additional challenges came and it was worked out between estates and the infection control team about what the protocol should be should one potential mobile HEPA filter be utilised in one space and moved to another area or be taken out of service for servicing. So I believe that standard operating procedure was developed as they started to be put into use, which essentially would be a service swap for one that was already clean, one that was already had new filters in it that could be deployed into the space, taken away, cleaned, serviced, and put back into clean storage, ready for redeployment.
If when we use the word validation, we mean checking that the thing does what it is that you as the end user want it to do.
Yes.
Am I taking it from your last answer that you don't remember any formal process, you just relied on what the manufacturers were able to tell you about the performance of these mobile filters?
I do remember looking at being asked how many should be. I can't remember who it was by, but it was asked how many should be deployed or what, how many should be allocated to each ward. And like for 6A, for example, I remember one of them being deployed in each of the patient bedrooms, and also within the corridor space. I think there was about 7 of them deployed. The only problem with the manufacturing information that I could see on the data sheets at the time was that the scrub rates of the HEPA filters was a 2-dimensional scrub rate, where it recommended it at 75 metres squared. But drilling down into the data sheet, it would give you associated metres cubed flow rate scrub capacity of the mobile HEPA filters, depending on what their speed setting was. And their speed settings went from 1 to 6. And given that the estates team had, at this point in time through the surveys of the wards to indicate what their change rates were and what the pressure profiles were, we knew what the flow rates were for those rooms, and that these filters at a certain speed would be more than what the volume of air being delivered to that space would be. So it would support a worthy and hopefully notable scrub rate. I think the thing about the validation part of it, and I see your comparison, under validation, we absolutely know from an engineering standpoint what the standard needs to be. It's quite clear within the SHTM. We know the pressure cascades we should see, we know the air change rates that we should see. When it comes to the scrubbing of particulate, I'm not aware of any kind of benchmark datum of what the level of particulate should be within a clinical space. So all we were able to demonstrate through case study and our infection control colleagues' support was that when these mobile HEPA filters were deployed into the space, there was a datum to record the levels of particulate through a light scattering particulate counter or a photometer, for example, of what the level of particulate was in that space based on the secondary filtration that was provided by the air handling unit, and then what it was after the mobile filters were employed. And there was a reduction, but to quantify whether that level of reduction is suitable or good for that patient group, I wouldn't be qualified to say.
Thank you. Just finally, for the moment at least, you were involved, at least to some extent, in the discussions over the specification for the new 2A ventilation system, and you explained how you were sitting in on meetings and so on. Do you know who, if anyone, from infection control was involved in these discussions?
I don't know who was involved from infection control. The best person I think that would be able to answer that question was James Huddleston. He was the project manager who was in charge of the project from a capital perspective and had wider visibility of all the stakeholders that were feeding into the refurnishment project. I don't know, I couldn't name a dedicated infection control individual that I know of.
Thank you. Well, these are all the questions that I have following discussions at the break. I'm conscious that if the CPs have not been aware, as we understand is correct, of the change of order of the witness, it's possible there may be additional questions. I wonder whether I might just take a couple of minutes now to check.
We'll do that. Mr. Conner, we're just checking as in the room, as it were, whether there's any further questions that Mr. Connell would wish to ask you. So we'll take 10 minutes, and we would hope to be back with you to either to ask you further questions or to confirm that that's the end of your oral evidence at 1:45.
Sure, no problem at all.
Right. Well, we'll take 10 minutes. Mr. Connell,
Obliged, Lord.
I understand you have some further.
I have a small number of questions, yes.
Right. Mr. Connor, some further questions from Mr. Connor.
Okay.
Can you help me with this, Mr. Conner? And again, as always, tell me if you can't. You mentioned earlier in your evidence about when we were talking about pigeons, and you said that one of the triggers there was that there was work being carried out to do rebalancing on some of the air handling units.
Yes.
Now, do you know who was doing that?
It was H&V commissioning.
H&V commissioning. That's a name we've heard before. And what did you say they were doing?
So they were rebalancing some of the air handling plant to support pressure profiles within associated wards served by those ventilation systems.
When you were giving that evidence, just off your own bat, as it were, you said you thought that was for 4C, 5D, 7D, and possibly one other. Do you know whether the other one was 6A, or do you not?
I don't. I believe it was because it was the cores that are served from the towers. So it was it was 4C, 5C, 5D, and 7D.
4C, 5C, 5D,
Yes.
and 7D.
Yes, that's correct.
Thank you. In your witness statement, and I'm not going to bother digging it out again, you tell us about being told by Ian Powery that there was death and possible connection to cryptococcus in December 2018. Do you remember whether there was any mention of microbiological sampling being scheduled to take place as a consequence?
I don't remember that being mentioned during that conversation. However, I do know through first-hand witnessing and assisting John Hood and his team in support of the investigation that a substantial amount of microbiological testing was carried out at different locations within the Queen Elizabeth campus.
Thank you. Again, harking back a little bit to evidence that you gave earlier, remember we had an exchange about Dr. Peters and what she did or did not know about photographs, and you say, well, you didn't mention the photographs, and it would have been for her to ask, I think, your line manager for them if she wanted them.
Yes.
And I suppose the question is, if you don't tell her they exist, how does she know they're there to ask about?
So my understanding at that time was that everybody that was involved in the process knew that there was an ongoing investigation, and that information was being collated and gathered, and opinions and specialist opinions were being gathered in order to deal with the incident. I thought there was an awareness that that was an ongoing process. That was certainly my understanding of it, because at that point in time there was weekly requests of actions to be carried out and requests for additional information in order to support both the IMT and the cryptococcus subgroup carrying that out. The only formal request that I recall getting was an email from John Hood requesting pictures in early 2019. I remember speaking to Colin Purden about that, saying that I'd received a request from John Hood asking for these pictures and would it be okay to send them on. And Colin said, yeah, that would be okay. And I subsequently went onto the shared drive, pulled the pictures off and emailed them over to John for his distribution and use.
Yeah. So at the time that you were with Dr. Peters, would I be right in thinking that you assumed she would know there would be things like photographs somewhere that she should go and ask about?
I was under I had the understanding that there was conversations. Bearing in mind my understanding in Christine Peters that she was quite a senior representative of the infection control team, if not the infection control doctor, and she would have been having conversations with my line managers who are leading, if you like, with the investigation. So from my perspective, that would be Ian, because he was my line manager.
Thank you. And just one final question, if I may, and this one is entirely my fault because I'm an old school person and assume that most messages are sent by email. Remember, I asked you whether you'd been receiving and or reading emails, receiving and reading emails during your earlier evidence, and you said no, you hadn't, and you certainly hadn't read any.
Yes.
I'm reminded that there are other methods of electronic communications, team messages, WhatsApps, and all kinds of other things. Have you been receiving any other electronic communications during the course of your evidence today?
I received a message from my partner just to ask me how I was and how I'm doing. I did see a Teams message pop up from my work, but I haven't answered it. And I think the last thing I want to do during this occasion is to check my emails, to be honest.
Thank you. I've nothing further, my Lord.
Mr. Conner, that is now the end of your evidence, and I would normally say to a witness, you're free to go, but I suppose you're free to switch off or the appropriate connection with the computer. But before you leave us, can I say thank you for your evidence this morning, and thank you for the work that will have gone in to preparing your witness statement, which, together with your oral evidence, makes up your contribution to the inquiry, for which I'm grateful. But that is the end of this session of oral evidence. Thank you very much, Mr. Conner.
Thank you, my Lord.
Now, we were just before o'clock. We will sit again at 2 when I understand that Ms. McKeever will be taking the evidence.
That is correct, Lord.
So we'll see each other at 2 o'clock.